We got some big names at the top of this week's PGA field because it's just that time of year. We got the Arnold Palmer Invitational this week. We got the Honda. We got the Players coming up, then the Honda, and then before you know it, it's going to be Masters time. So, I mean, it's that time of year where we get some of the best golfers in action week in and week out. And this week for the Arnold Palmer at Bay Hill, you hear a lot about Rory McIlroy. It's deserved for sure. He's got a win at Bay Hill, just elite form, elite finishes at this ball strikers course. But he's not alone. Last year's winner, Tyrrell Hatton, enters with good form. Victor Hovland, once he's not in the bushes, in the bunkers, going back and forth, he's red hot outside of basically one hole last week at the WGC workday at Concession. But I mean, there's plenty to discuss, even if it's not the deepest possible field. So welcome on into the FanDuel PGA Q&A for this week's PGA Tour event. I'm your host, Brandon Gdula. I'm the managing editor over at numberFire.com. I'll be talking about the field, the betting odds on FanDuel Sportsbook, the daily fantasy slate on FanDuel, my win simulations, and whatever else you want to discuss, because this is a Q&A format. So just hit up the comment section on YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, or Twitch if you have questions for this week's event. Now, we do have a cut this week, so different format than what we had a week ago, but it is an invitational, so it's not a full field. It's about 120 golfers. So the made cut percentage overall gets a bit better by default, but that does not necessarily mean that anyone's guaranteed to play the weekend at what can be a tough golf course, what can play tough, especially in the wind. But again, I mean, you just look here at the top. We see Rory McIlroy listed at 8.5 to 1 to win on FanDuel Sportsbook, followed by Victor Hovland at 12 to 1, Bryson DeChambeau 13 to 1, Tyrrell Hatton again, who won last year, 17 to 1, Patrick Reed, always undervalued, always a little bit underappreciated, at 21 to 1, Matthew Fitzpatrick actually back up to 22. He was 23, then 27, now 22. So you got to like that on one of my favorite golfers for this week. Sungjae Im, 23. I'm not going to list off everyone, but again, we have Rory who kind of stands out by himself, which is why he's 8.5 to 1. But then from there, I mean, we still have some other good options. So it's not just Rory or bust this week by any means. But I will say you can see the odds kind of fall off pretty quickly. We get down into like the 55 to 60 to 1 odds fairly quickly. It's not completely different than normal, but what you find is if you're someone who likes to look for daily fantasy purposes, looking for guys with low salaries and good win odds, if you kind of make that your combination, like your sort of overall shortcut, you're not going to find a whole lot of that this week just because the field does fall off pretty quickly. So what matters at Bay Hill, which stats are important, what might lead to success for golfers. I will talk about that now. But again, if you have any questions about this week's field, hit up the YouTube chat. That's easiest for me, but Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, try to get to everything that we can. So historically, the Arnold Palmer Invitational plays very differently from year to year, depending on whether there's wind. Last year, Tyrrell Hatton won in a pretty weather-affected tournament at 4 under par over Mark Leishman, Sungjae Im, Bryson DeChambeau, Rory McIlroy, Danny Lee in the top 5 as well. The year before, Francesco Molinari, 12 under, so 8 strokes different there. But Matthew Fitzpatrick, Rafa Cabrera-Bello, Tommy Fleetwood, Sungjae Im, Rory again, top 6. You'll see Rory at the top of all these. But the year before, Rory was at the top, 18 under. Bryson popping as well, 15 under. Justin Rose, Henrik Stenson. A lot of international names if you're following along in that regard. The year before, another non-American, I should say, with Mark Leishman winning at 11 under. So again, these scores change a lot. And then Jason Day, 17 under. But that's 5 straight years with a non-American winner, which is possibly relevant. It's possibly not, but sometimes that means that the conditions. I can't back this up with any evidence, but the general rule of thumb is like windier courses tend to be something that some of these Europeans, some of these international guys can kind of thrive in. Take it for what it's worth. But again, what I'm more interested in is the variation in scores at the top. It just kind of depends on how the weather breaks for this week. But I also like to look at this tool here, which shows what drives variation in score at each particular course relative to the PGA Tour average. This week we see strokes gained off the tee a little bit more important in terms of explaining the variation in score. But it's still only 16.3%. What we see is actually a boost in strokes gained approach, which is always the number one stat because it's just basically, you can gain and lose the most strokes from approach play compared to strokes gained off the tee and strokes gained around the green. The field leaders in approach just put more distance between themselves and the rest of a field than they can with some of the other stats. Putting's close, but actually you do see a little bit of a de-emphasis here. 32.1% of the variation is explained by putting, which is down from almost 36% as the tour average. So what this means to me is that ball striking is what separates. Ball striking being, how you drive the ball so that's strokes gained off the tee, and then how you hit your fairway woods and your long irons specifically. That is strokes gained approach, but using this other course fit tool from Data Golf, we see distance showing up more important than average on the PGA Tour. Accuracy, not so much. So if you're picking between one of the key stats, it's going to be or one of the driving stats. It should be driving distance. I always tend to prefer driving distance because you can't fake distance. You can always club down. Well, some of these guys, they can club down and hit a fairway if they need to, but this week, we should see an emphasis on driving distance as opposed to driving accuracy. Now, putting actually is about as important as average on the PGA Tour, maybe even a little bit more if we zoom in here. But what that kind of means is that putting's still important, but it's not going to be what separates the guys at the top so much. It's going to be instead the ball striking, the tee to green play. So that's kind of what that's showing us here. So overall, what I'm looking for in terms of key stats, it's going to be strokes gained approach, number one, strokes gained off the tee, number two, driving distance, number three, but driving distance does explain a lot of off the tee. So don't, if you kind of build out your own model and weight things, don't, just exercise some caution. Don't give both of those stats, 25% of the weight, because you'll be double counting a lot of that. I'm wavering between birdie and better rate gain because, again, we do see this course play fairly easily sometimes, but we also see it play difficult. So, birdie or better rate gained, possibly bogey avoidance. I'm not totally sure, but what is going to get us there anyway is the better approach play and the off the tee play. Now, putting is, again, it's going to separate the guys a little bit less, but it's still important. It's not something that we can completely avoid. Greens are Bermuda this week, if you factor that in. So it's on my list for key stats because it always should be. But one of the things I'm okay doing this week, and this is not something I do, I've made this a bit of a new decision for me over like the past year or so, where putting matters more to me than it used to, because putting is not completely random. But for this week specifically, I'm willing to overlook putting if you are elite tee to green. If you're just like okay and you're not a good putter, it's going to be really hard to contend here because it is a pretty tough field, all things considered. So putting, not as key of a stat, but still something that matters. So effectively what you need is ball strikers and putters. But if you can't putt, make sure that you are elite tee to green, because that is important for this week. I have a question from Aaron on YouTube. Could you rank these players who are similar salaries? Corey Connors, Lonto Griffin, Taylor Gooch, and Kevin Kisner. I can do that. Off the top of my head, I'm going to prefer Lonto, Connors. Actually, it's always, I love Taylor Gooch. Taylor Gooch and Lonto Griffin are two of my, generally in the lower salaried range, just because they're so balanced. So they're right here in the low 9,000 range. Gooch, Lonto, Corey Connors, they're all three names I've highlighted, and then Kevin Kisner as well. So he's 9,500. So not quite on my list. I was on him last week. He was okay. Started off hot, but for Kisner, let's look at him specifically. Actually, I can do this. It'll take a second. I always feel weird doing this, but if we just make them their own color here, I can just filter and just get a nice. So they all rate out pretty similarly in terms of win expectation based on my model. Not great win odds overall, but definitely not terrible. The adjusted strokes gained numbers for me, I take these and from event by event scoring in the strokes gained stats, and then adjust them for field strength based on a combination of a few things, but all somewhat similar. Gooch actually rating out the worst here. But here's the thing with Connors that draws me to him is he's one of those golfers where you can see the putting is bad, 25th percentile in adjusted strokes gained putting over the past calendar year, but 96th percentile tee to green. So he's one of the few guys who I was just talking about where if you can't putt, but you're elite tee to green, you can make the list. So Connors does that for me. These other guys are much better putters, all green, so 75th percentile or above for me. But they are sort of in the middle, around 60th percentile tee to green. So a more balanced, a higher floor play is going to be either Kisner, Gooch, or Lonto. A more volatile play will be Corey Connors, but he does come in at 200 below even Lonto. So if I had to rank these guys, I'm probably going to go with... It might, it's going to be Lonto, Gooch, Connors, and then Kisner, just because Kisner does not have the distance. So I don't know if the ball striking is going to be quite enough to get him in contention into, the high end outcomes, regardless of what the model says for this week. Another question from Oliver on YouTube. How do you feel about using players with no course history at this course? Cam Percy, for example, was in good form, plays well in wind, stats line up, but has no course history. So course history is something I've talked about once or twice on this show, where it matters a little bit, but it's never something that I factor in heavily. What I like to do, again, is go to Data Golf. I use them a lot just because they have great tools, which, anyone can use most of these tools, especially the ones that I'm using here, but they have a course history tool that shows how predictive and how important course history is at a course. At Bay Hill, we do see it a little bit higher than normal, but I will almost never, outside of Augusta, which is this huge bar here, outside of Augusta, I will almost never write off any golfers who have no course history, just because we've seen golfers play well in their debuts at different courses. So I wouldn't use that as a reason not to like him, especially if the current form is good and you like what else is there from his profile. I'll just highlight Percy. 7,700 is a really good salary on FanDuel. Rates out a little bit below the tour average in adjusted strokes gained overall. Doesn't rate out very well in my win simulation model, but at 210 to 1 on FanDuel Sport, respect that. But good approach numbers, 55th percentile, and good bogey avoidance. So for being 7,700, this is actually a fine profile. I don't love it, but I wouldn't use the lack of course history. If you see something in Cam Percy, like you said, with good form, playing well in wind, I would not use this week. It is, especially with the value being what it is, I wouldn't use that as something to disqualify any particular golfer. I'm going to look at the top of the field here because we have Rory at 8.5 to 1, 12,300 on FanDuel. So he's the highest salaried golfer that we have this week historically, and pretty much always, especially with Rory's course form. you would expect that he carries the highest roster rate by far, at least comfortably so, among the studs. But if you look at his profile, there's not a whole lot to dislike, especially if you're on board with de-emphasizing putting. I don't know why that went haywire, but 59th percentile long-term putting, but actually Bermuda is his best putting surface. He rates out in the 70th percentile and strokes gained putting on Bermuda over the past 100 rounds compared to everybody else. So I don't really have any issues with Rory. The main concern comes in with rostering someone at 12,300 whenever the value is not particularly appealing. There are some names who are worth dart throws, but I don't necessarily think that Rory is so much better than Victor Hovland, Tyrrell Hatton, Matthew Fitzpatrick, who I don't know why is not green there, but he should be because he's one of my favorite plays. So no issues with Rory. It's mostly a leverage play if you want to get away from him. But Hatton and Fitzpatrick specifically are golfers who I really, really, really like. I don't know why this is happening. But Hatton, last year's winner, rates out well across the board aside from around the green, which is never a particularly key stat, and it doesn't necessarily appear to be particularly key for this week. And then Fitzpatrick plays well in the wind, plays well at tough courses. It's kind of what his game prefers. His like lone red flag is the lack of distance where he can really separate, but he still manages to gain strokes off the tee because he's so accurate. So I don't want to disqualify him for that. Another question on YouTube from Matthew. I have a bet where you can bet someone versus Rory. Who would you pick that you would bet your most money on to beat Rory? Straight up, probably either Hatton or Hovland this week. Hovland's in such good form. He leads the field in adjusted strokes gained tee to green over the past calendar year. And it just is very, very similar to Rory outside of the Bermuda putting. That's kind of the big concern with Hovland still, is the short game is getting a lot better. But if you kind of look at anything outside of the past few rounds for him, it's not great. So if I had to go one single golfer over Rory, it would be Tyrrell Hatton for me this week. Another question from Thomas. Low value guys, please rank Kazire, Kirk, Munoz, and Stanley. And if you would rule out one of them over another player around the same value. So let me take a look here. I will say right now, my favorite out of that group is going to be Sebastian Munoz. Simply for the fact that he is so well balanced. If you look at him here, very nice adjusted strokes gained tee to green numbers in the 69th percentile, and no red flags for him across any of the somewhat key stats for this week. Munoz showed back up last week. He finished 22nd, but he can kind of go on tears. And I always like Munoz because he's very balanced and doesn't have a ton of weaknesses, especially at a salary of $8,500. Now, Kazire, let me look here because I do actually I have a list of some bullets who I'm okay with, which I usually try to avoid. I know it's tempting, and I know I always feel a little guilty not building around golfers who are super low salaried, but the win equity is very low and the cut odds are low for a reason. And I think that you can really build better lineups with a more balanced build. But Kazire here, he's a great putter. Not necessarily great tee to green, not necessarily good with the irons, and I'm prioritizing ball striking, so I'm not going to be in on Kazire this week. Who else? Chris Kirk here, much better tee to green, specifically through the around the green, which is not important for me this week, but the ball striking being there, not necessarily from distance, but I'm okay with that. And then I know what I'm going to see from Kyle Stanley here. Great irons, not great putting. That's kind of what he is. So again, I would recommend playing based on an archetype build where you are, say you are okay saying putting is not that important this week. It's going to be more about ball striking. So you go with someone like a Victor Hovland, who has, I would bet Victor Hovland to lead the field in strokes gained tee to green. Don't know what's going to happen with the putter. But someone like Luke List, even Corey Connors, these guys who are not necessarily great putters, but are a great ball striker. So I kind of build it as an archetype there. But Munoz number one for me easily. Then probably Stanley, Kirk, and Kazire for me this week. Another question from Facebook from Sal: who's a good long shot top 10? Long shot top 10. I've actually been struggling this week with my betting card. I think it's going to include Fitzpatrick, who's now, back to 22 from 27. But I'll flip over to my betting model here. I don't have my top 10 values on here, but we can kind of extrapolate from there. Long shot top 10s. Let's go down the list here. Let's see what Tringali is. Lonto Griffin. I don't know what his top 10 odds are, but Lonto always rates out well. So does Tringali for me. Brendan Todd probably won't get into trouble here. He'll just be, hitting fairways and making putts. So he's not necessarily someone I would love, but my model, there's actually two different models averaged together. Kind of like him this week. If I had to pick one, at this point, it's going to be Lonto for a top 10. If that's not long enough for you, I would say Henrik Norlander. Very good numbers from him. Good on Bermuda. And, good tee to green numbers overall. Alexander Noren always screwing up every spreadsheet. But 80th percentile adjusted strokes gained tee to green, primarily through the ball striking, not from around the green. So that checks out for a ball striking course. At least that's what I'm looking at. And then good on Bermuda, 77th percentile there over the past 100 rounds. So Norlander is someone that I'm okay with. He's actually highlighted in green because he's one of my favorite value plays from a daily fantasy standpoint as well. So I'd probably look to those two, maybe even Sebastian Munoz. Those would be the names I'd be looking for a top 10. Again, if we go back and think about who actually wins here, it's mostly the better names with Hatton, Jason Day, Rory, Molinari, Leishman. I've been saying that a lot for the past few weeks, but generally when we see somewhat tough fields, we see better golfers win. Because it's not like you just have to beat Rory. You have to beat Victor Hovland. Bryson, who my models actually rate as the odds-on favorite. But Patrick Reed's there. He's always like kind of the forgotten man. Hatton, Fitzpatrick, Sungjae Im on Bermuda is always pretty lethal. Especially if the irons are there. They kind of have been trending back down for him, but you never know with Sungjae. He can always kind of put it together. So Molinari's in good form, but I would bet that the winner doesn't really come from like the 100 to and beyond range, probably not even like the 70 and beyond range. I would probably put the cutoff around 65 to 1. Of course, anything can happen, especially if things get windy and get a little messy. But overall, I'm going to treat this as I treat most of the tougher fields where I'm balancing out the betting card. So I'm not going to be on Rory at 8.5 to 1. It's pretty tough, especially for someone who I wouldn't necessarily trust the putter to be fantastic. I'm going to be looking more at possibly Tyrrell Hatton to start the card, but if not, like Fitzpatrick. Francesco Molinari is interesting. Will Zalatoris, if you want ball striking, he's got that. Sam Burns, he's got to recover from the Genesis, but his lone blemish really is missing fairways. So I guess two lone blemishes, if you can even say that, but missing fairways and gaining strokes around the green, which should not matter a ton this week. So I like Sam Burns. So these are some of the names that I'd be looking at to sort of start a card. No mention of Casey yet. You staying off him from Thomas on YouTube. So I recorded the Heat Check Daily Fantasy Podcast with Jim Sonis earlier today, and he likes Paul Casey a lot. And Jim's smart, but for me, from a daily fan, okay, so from a betting standpoint, it's always hard to get behind Paul Casey just because he doesn't convert wins very frequently. I don't think that's relevant, but it's always hard with Casey. And then from a daily fantasy standpoint, with he and Fitzpatrick being so close in salary, you look at the adjusted tee to green numbers, almost the same. Off the tee, almost the same. Approach, almost the same. And then Fitzpatrick just separates in the short game, and then on Bermuda as well. The one benefit to Casey relative to Fitzpatrick is the distance, where he can definitely gain. And if we're looking at a ball striking course where short game might not matter, Paul Casey fits. Or a Luke List, if you say, look, I'm just going to roster the best tee to green guys I can and not care so much about putting, Paul Casey fits. I think there's a lot of value in looking at archetypes, because if that's how the course plays, where it is all about ball striking, it is all about the driver and the irons, and less so about the putting, and you combine 6 guys who have that skill set, that is never really a bad thing. Mixing and matching can be a little more. Again, and this is not something I do in every single lineup, but if you're building, even one lineup, possibly play like an archetype angle. So from that perspective, I wouldn't dislike Casey, but I'm not quite there myself, just because solely from a daily fantasy standpoint, Fitzpatrick. So who do I take over Casey in the same range? Fitzpatrick specifically. I'm very clear on that. Now, I will agree that the 10,000 range is not specifically enticing. Hideki, again, he would fit an archetype where you look just at the ball striking, the tee to green, and downplay putting. Spieth, Spieth's long enough, and the irons have been there, and he can putt. So, I would maybe consider Spieth over Casey. But then we drop down into a less appealing range overall. So I'm with you. I guess I need to clarify then. I like Fitzpatrick so much more than Casey that I don't anticipate playing Casey very much. But below Casey, I think it drops off. So I'm much better with Paul Casey than Hideki, Spieth, Louis Oosthuizen, Jason Day, Billy Horschel coming off a really good finish. He's going to be inflated here in terms of salary. And Francesco Molinari doesn't really we're getting into $700 difference in salary. So that's not very fair, but I would rank Casey. Let's make it realistic here and go Hatton, Sungjae, Fitz, Casey, Hideki, Spieth. I would go Hatton, Fitzpatrick, possibly Sungjae, and then Casey. So that's kind of how I view that tier. It's nothing against Paul Casey. It's just more about the other golfers, this week. Again, running out of time here. Had a lot more questions than usual, which is great. That's what this is for. But here's a last look at my win simulation model. It's been a hard one to kind of figure out for me. I'm probably going to be in the more balanced range again this week. And at this point, I know for sure I'm going to be on Matthew Fitzpatrick. From there, I'm not sure, but I'm probably just going to trust the model value here and go through and look for some top 10s from the long shots, not necessarily bet any long shots to win. But that is all the time I have for today. You can check out all my content on numberFire.com. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Gdula13. Best of luck this week, and let's hit a winner.